I'm not going to beat around the bush. If you consider yourself a horror fan at all, you need to watch this movie. This is not negotiable. Evil Ed is a 1995 Swedish horror comedy directed by Anders Jacobsson, who not only shot the film, but edited and co-wrote it with producer Göran Lundström and Krista Olsson. This is unironically one of my favorite movies, and definitely my go-to when the Halloween season comes around. However, I don't just love Evil Ed the movie as much as I love Evil Ed the historic event. The way that this movie was made, how it got released, and the success it had afterwards is nothing short of a Halloween miracle, Charlie Brown. The only thing that's crazier than this movie's plot is its production history, but we'll get to that later. If you somehow need more convincing, then you need not look further than the trailer. Hell yeah, dude. This is what I want in my 90s horror movies. Unapologetic, gross-out cartoon violence and an edgy nu metal soundtrack. Evil Ed is right up there with the illest legends. Korn, Slipknot, and Limp Bizkit. I once had a professor say that you can tell when a movie is made by people who love movies. And I think that's a perfect way to describe Evil Ed. On one hand, Evil Ed is an indulgent, messy parody of all the nastiest parts of horror entertainment. But on the other, it's a scathing critique of a film culture that is resistant to freedom of expression. Speaking of freedom, you could literally watch it on YouTube right now. It's free. Now you have no excuse. Because I'm me, I have both a VHS copy and the Blu-ray Special Edition. Not only is the comparison between the two night and day, especially with the added scenes in the Blu-ray, but the VHS copy has this stupid pop-up every so often. Gee, for screening purposes only? You didn't tell me a million times enough on the tape itself. Plus, the Blu-ray comes with exclusive interviews that I will be referring to throughout this video. Anyways, without major spoilers, the plot goes a little something like this. Edward Tor Svensson is a nerdy little film editor working for a European distribution company, even though the film pretends to be set in America. From his usual job cutting Swedish art house films that would make Ingmar Bergman blush, he gets transferred to the aptly named Splatter and Gore department. There, he's tasked by the sleazy owner, Sam Campbell, to cut the X-rated material out of his films for European distribution.
You keep them heads rolling here.
This is a job that pencil-necked Eddie over here doesn't quite have the stomach for, as watching movies full of violence and sex isn't really his thing. Bro, this is literally the easiest paycheck of your life. You're not Walter Murch crafting together a multicam action sequence. You're just slashing the slash out of the slasher fic that's already finished. I could do that with Da Vinci in an afternoon. You gotta love the title of this shit he's working on too.
Loose Limbs 5. The Anatomy of Fear.
Loose Limbs. Yeah, I wanna watch that one next.
My foot!
Well, hey, don't thank me. Thanks, science.
Cut to Nick, another employee in the Splatter and Gore department, who also has the easiest film job ever. Not only does he get paid a living wage to deliver film reels to Ed's house whenever he fucking feels like it, but he actually enjoys the movies his employers make, and he gets to laze around half the day watching them. Edward, on the other hand, finds these films sickening, yet he's the one stuck with watching them. They're sort of character foils in that regard. But by the time they meet, Eddie's already started to become corrupted by the edge.
Hi.
In the midst of his spiraling mental state, Edward is confronted by a demon in a padded cell, only referred to in the credits as Bondage Face, who gradually edifies him in the art of censoring evil.
The whole world needs to be corrected.
Now Poindexter's gone twacked out on goofballs because he done seen too many spookies, and the ghost of William S. Hayes wants him to cleanse the world of degeneracy, one cut at a time. He's also accompanied by his friendly new hallucinations, featuring the most unique practical monster effects since Gremlins.
Fuck you, man!
Right here, when Ed becomes evil in fulfillment of the scriptures, he ascends to the throne as the greatest character in horror history. Johan Rudebeck did an amazing job interpreting this character, in my opinion. His overacting is the stuff of legends, infinitely quotable. Evil Ed's got more lines than a convention.
Dying time.
This is what happens if you fuck!
So you like headbanging, eh?
Eventually, his wife shoots him, and he gets sent off to a mental facility, where he is treated and his emotional distress is dealt with healthily, and he goes on to live a normal life. Edward breaks out of his room, going on to terrorize the patients and staff at the hospital. This requires the friggin' A-team to be called in, but all the guns and all the military might in the world are no match for Evil Ed, who now has the power of God and new metal on his side.
Come on out of there, you sick son of a bitch!
Edward shoots through armored law enforcements like Gordon Freeman in Half-Life 2, leading to an epic final showdown, the conclusion of which you're just gonna have to see for yourself. Trust me, you're not mentally prepared for the last 3 minutes of this movie. Evil Ed was somehow both a symptom and a cause of horror's state in the mid-90s. The genre was looking back on almost 100 years of film history, not just with remakes, but also in attempts to revitalize and revisit some of the most firmly established tropes within the genre. Movies like Candyman and Scream were an active deconstruction of the slasher, exploring themes of race and life imitating cinema through a genre that was believed to have no real artistic value. You'll find that Evil Ed's deconstruction comes not just in the form of references to other horror movies, but also in its masterful filmmaking techniques, especially its editing. Evil Ed has what I like to call editing butter. Basically, it's smoother than a hot knife through a foot.
My foot!
You really gotta hand it to Anders Jacobsson again for what seems to be like tireless work on this movie. Mad respect to anyone who writes, shoots, and edits on the independent level. The scene where Ed kills Sam Campbell was clearly constructed with multiple takes that were probably not meant to end up in this sequence, given how ever so slightly the positions don't match up. But the way the motion is carried between 3 shots that should be too quick and disorienting for an audience to follow creates a swift action that almost masks the hasty cuts. I'm sure a lot of editors out there could tell me about all the technical ways it doesn't quite add up, but fuck you, it's my video. This kind of motion draws closer attention to a subject when cutting, and smooths out what would otherwise be a jarring juxtaposition in the frames. Just like how a cut like this is a lot less jarring than a cut like this, the latter just breaks up the motion too much. The jump cut that Evil Ed does use, as clunky and faux pas as those are in cinema, are actually made with intentionality, especially to convey emotions like fear. I refer you to Walter Murch's Rule of 6 in his book, In the Blink of an Eye, when figuring out your editing motivations for a cut. God, I can't believe I'm talking this way about a movie with shit like this in it. Multiple interviews with the crew mention how the rough cut of the film was too slow, so they added some scenes, cut others, and made the edits tighter to speed up the pacing. Yes, the irony that a story about ruining movies in the editing room was saved in the editing room is not lost on me. A lot of the shots and techniques Evil Ed uses are lifted straight from other famous horror movies. You want a list of their cited sources? Check the posters in the background. The tracking shot from the Evil Dead series is one that almost every horror fan recognizes, a film that this one obviously owes a lot to. Another reference comes in the form of the boss's name.
I'm Sam Campbell.
A nod to Evil Dead director Sam Raimi and main star Bruce Campbell. There are a ton of other movie references, but I'm gonna let you discover some of them for yourself. Obviously, Evil Ed isn't good just because of its intertextuality with other films. I already mentioned a lot of the creature effects, but what I enjoy the most is the lighting, and especially how it makes the colors pop. The full scope of which can't really be seen in the VHS version. The blue tint of the nighttime scene against the dull daylight hours visually separates the real world from Ed's hallucinations. Shadow is utilized the best in the former, falling thoughtfully in the background when Eddie starts luring Nick into his trap. The carefully planned lighting through the windows casts a natural yet distorted shadow in the background, giving the scene greater depth and texture. This shot genuinely freaked me out, where Ed is lit so particularly that you can only see the blue of his right pupil. I know it wasn't an accident because it's still there from the other angle. Despite how funny he is, Ed has some very strange moments where his face is genuinely terrifying. According to Johan Rudebeck, director Anders Jacobsson wanted to focus more on how the shots looked rather than on guiding the actors' performances. This gave Rudebeck complete freedom to interpret the character, and Jacobsson shot him based on whether he wanted scary or funny out of the performance, leaving us with one of the best killers in horror film history. While Ed is obviously the most important character and the reason you should watch the film, I'd argue that there's a second one that's just as crucial as he is. No, it's not Nick, sorry. In my opinion, the edits that Ed makes are their own characters. Not just the hallucinations that manifest from them, no. The actual films themselves that we hear constantly throughout the movie. Watching Evil Ed, you'll notice that you never actually see what's happening on the editing monitor.
There you are, you little motherfucking shithead!
Despite this, what it says seems to affect the surrounding environment through its auditory presence alone. One of Evil Ed's strongest yet most overlooked aspects is its sound design. There's this one transition here where the editing machine's hum phases into the ambience of the hospital in Loose Limbs. The one sound that I like the most is the baby crying when Eddie meets Bondage Face. With the context of why people call for the censorship of horror films to begin with, to protect the kids and all, to me this represents the death of Ed's innocence before adding evil to his name. But that might just be me reading too deep into Bondage's spiel about correcting the world or whatever. The soundtrack is also incredible. I love this song, Dry Bones by Delta Rhythm Boys, and the way it degenerates and chromatically descends a half step at a time, creating a musical sense of things turning from innocent to sinister real fast. A kid's nursery rhyme about skeletal misinformation propaganda is given a new context as Ed tears a body limb from limb. According to the included documentary in the Blu-ray, the soundtrack was written over a completely silent version of the film, which only serves to boost its cartoony mood. Upon watching Evil Ed, you can definitely get hints of Buster Keaton-like comedy in conjunction with the jaunty fanfare. Yeah! Quick side note about the soundtrack. This song that I've been making fun of, it's lost media. As far as I can tell, it's called Scram by It's Alive because it's mentioned in the credits, but other than that, I can't find a full version of the song. The only snippet of it that actually exists appears to be in the background of the trailer and the movie. Anyways, Evil Ed flexes all of its filmmaking muscles in this scene here. It starts with Ed repeatedly playing back a scene depicting a man murdering a woman with sickening glee. Notice how we are only given Ed's reaction to this, his vacant stare as the assailant shouts, "Don't you fucking look at me!" I love how you hear the distortion of the footage as he constantly cycles through it. It's worth pointing out that this line, "Don't you fucking look at me!" is a direct quote from Frank Booth, Dennis Hopper's character in Blue Velvet, who is also a sadistic killer.
Don't you fucking look at me.
I'll let you guys draw your own intertextual parallels when you watch Evil Ed, not if. The scene continues with Ed stopping the playback out of pure disgust, leaving the dark room in total silence. He then stands up, looking off to the left, which naturally carries the audience's attention to that side of the screen. His sudden turning motion quickly switches the focus to the right, and before your eyes have time to adjust, you're hit with a jump cut to... Wow, the Beetlejuice remake looks great. Love the costume. I just disagree with the casting of Captain Knuckles from Flapjack. Don't you fucking look at me! That same musical sting, by the way, is used when Ed flips that line on his wife before he tries to stab her, representing him becoming the very killer he feared.
Don't you fucking look at me, bitch!
This is one of my favorite jump scares, not because I find it scary, but because it's so damn goofy. It also doesn't just rely on a sting sound and an abrupt motion. The composition guides your attention towards the scare through how your gaze naturally falls on a 2D projection of a 3D space, which is what motion picture is. It's actually kind of genius. Before I get into why I think this movie is not just enjoyable and fun, but also the best movie to watch around the Halloween season, I want to go over some of the more interesting stories that I heard about the production of this film, because most of this is from the documentary You Keep Them Heads Rolling, which is a Blu-ray exclusive. The 16mm camera that was used was apparently traded for a bottle of whiskey with a caretaker from the SVT TV channel. Even though the film was recorded in English, the Swedish actors were all dubbed by Americans at Bandit Radio, an all-English-speaking station in Sweden.
Always nice with a warm welcome. I hope it wasn't meant to keep me out.
Always nice with a warm welcome. I hope it wasn't meant to keep me out.
Camilla Leijert, I don't know how to say her name, Leijert, is the only exception who was allowed to dub herself, though she shifts into her Swedish accent occasionally.
Stop it, Nick, stop it.
She didn't even read the whole script, showing up on the first day of filming thinking that she was going to be in a comedy. You have no idea how much this actually happens in Hollywood. Bill Mosley guest starred and dubbed the killer in the fake Loose Limb films. He was also in Army of Darkness, the third movie in the Evil Dead trilogy, drawing another parallel between these two films. The creature effects all clearly had a lot of effort put in, with the Fridge Goblin being redesigned due to Jacobsson's dissatisfaction with the original. All of the squibs, which are tiny explosives used to make realistic bullet wounds, were homemade, which is something you should never do as a non-professional film pyrotechnician, ever! One of them almost killed Johann Rudebeck. This reaction is real pain. Another actor almost made past tense by this movie is Per Löfberg, the one who plays Nick. In the scene where he falls through the glass ceiling in the hospital, he hits the ground so hard that the crew thought he died in front of them. Turns out it was only a pulled muscle. It was sugar glass, but apparently Per originally wanted it to be real glass. I wonder why they didn't let him do that. As I mentioned before, Evil Ed is both a slasher film and a deconstruction of the slasher film. Being a gross-out parody of its contemporaries, it is unfortunately given to the same sexist and ableist tropes that still seem to plague the genre to this day. Violence towards women, outdated portrayals of mental illness. I think there's like a racist Asian accent bit in the movie.
Me so horny.
I think many other horror movies are a lot more problematic in what they show explicitly on screen, but at the same time, I can't tell you not to be offended by Evil Ed's flagrant mishandling of touchy subjects. But I argue that for every ugly stereotype that Evil Ed seems to perpetuate, it makes up for with its very nuanced take on film censorship. The film was made as a subtle protest to European film censorship practices, with Ed's job being a real thing that had to be done to imported films, albeit to a much less extreme degree. There was a real moral panic going on in Sweden that I can't really get into. This YouTuber Pim's Crypt, who I really enjoy, did a much better job talking about this than I ever could. They're actually Swedish, so anything that I could have said would not have matched to them, so just please go check out their video, tell them I sent you. All you really need to know is that there was a serious concern around horror movies supposedly corrupting the youth and causing them to do violent acts. Eddie is a stand-in for this moral panic. Someone tasked to censor horror entertainment without any idea of why it exists in the first place or who it's even for. He is revolted by it and imagines that revolting people are the only ones who can make, watch, or even enjoy it. Nick is the complete opposite. He's a passive enjoyer of horror movies. He has no say in how they're distributed or censored, but he is the main demographic who would be affected by those changes. Unlike Ed, he can watch these films and separate fiction from reality. He's not convinced that they are real, nor is he compelled to commit violent crimes because of it. In fact, he only becomes violent in retaliation to Ed later in the film. Although it's a facetious way of making the statement, this is actually an informed and valid criticism of film censorship. Edward hates horror. He can't relate to it, doesn't want to understand it, but is now stuck dealing with it because others demand it of him. He also doesn't have time for nuance because too many things hinge on him just doing the task at hand. His job, his reputation, his sanity. Kinda sounds like panic lawmakers harassed by scared parents writing legislation desperate to hold on to power, doesn't it? When you obsess over eradicating depravity, you start to see it everywhere, even in places where it isn't really happening. Films are not actual occurrences of violence, but because Ed genuinely believes that they are, he commits it first under the loose justification of correcting evil. Think of the language that's being used there for a second. Editing the violence, the plot essentially, out of these films is correcting them. Through a strict morally conservative view of art, bad art is better than transgressive art. Incomplete, butchered narratives are preferable to the existence of something that you don't like. Who cares that a meticulously planned structure that goes into every movie is now edited out, removing any point in watching it? At least there wasn't any blood or tits! You can now let your children safely watch Human Centipede 2. Thanks, Eddie! But in the end, Evil Ed won. It was shown at the Cannes Film Festival in 1995. It was bought and exported by about 60 countries and translated into several languages. The censorship that it was protesting was finally gone, and what little censorship it did go through was very local and minuscule in comparison. This movie fought hard for horror to be considered great cinema by being great cinema. Like I said before, it's a movie that loves movies. And when all that is said and done, why is Evil Ed the best Halloween movie in my opinion? Well, I believe that Halloween isn't a celebration of horror. It's a celebration of how we deal with horror. From its inception, the scary movie has served as a secondary reality in which emotions like fear can be simulated and dealt with. And what mystifies us the most about horror is its supposed ability to transcend the barriers of the fourth wall. From video nasty bans in the UK to the Satanic Panic in the US, media centered around the darker sides of human experience have been targeted for this fear alone. The idea that witnessing portrayals of violence could cause you to do violence. While that possibility isn't completely off of the table, I think it's a classic case of correlation not equaling causation. People aren't violent because the media is violent. Rather, the media is violent because it reflects human history. We are violent. And perhaps that's the biggest horror that there is. You can't stop heinous acts at the source because it doesn't have one. I think the healthiest thing to do is to accept that and go about our lives being able to separate fiction from fact. It seems like we spend more efforts on protecting ourselves from fake violence than we do real violence. We censor more often than we disarm ourselves. The world is a scary place. It's a lot more comforting to blame some Pandora's box for all of its pain than it is to wrestle with the fact that, realistically, each and every one of us is capable of evil. especially a nerdy little dweeb named Edward.
Evil Ed lost his head because he was too squeamish. Rotten to the core, he thirsts for gore, but that's just 'cause he's Swedish.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Please subscribe, give me a like. Have you ever seen Evil Ed? Did you like it? Please let me know down below. And if you have watched Evil Ed and you didn't really enjoy it, well, don't you fucking look at me!
Dabble, frabble, camel, apple, capple, milkshake with chocolate cream. Don't you scream! The coolie, truly, groupie, take your ass to coolie beans. Know what I mean?
No? What the fuck?
Doobie doobie Venus, suck my penis.
Oh, stop.
You ready? And you're with